Welcome to Back to the Text Themselves, a series on phenomenology. Today we wrap up the introduction to being in time by continuing our examination of Section 7 as well as Section 8. In this video, I'll address the following questions. 1. How is phenomenology related to ontology? 2. Why is phenomenological ontology a hermeneutic enterprise? And 3. How should we approach being in time in light of Heidegger's association with Nazism? If you learned something new from this video and want to support this work, please consider liking it, sharing it, and subscribing to my channel. In the previous video, we considered the etymology of the two words that make up phenomenology, phenomenon and logos. Logos in this context concerns the way discourse allows the self-showing of the phenomenon to disclose itself. I mentioned that some discourses better facilitate this disclosure of the phenomenon while others enable its concealment. Here we arrive at a distinct notion of truth and falsity. In the correspondence theory of truth, a true statement is one that correctly reflects an actual state of affairs in the world. Phenomenological truth, by contrast, entails a discourse that lets something be seen as unconcealed. Falsity, then, is a covering up that blocks off or restricts the self-showing of the phenomenon. It's a dissimulation that puts something in front of the self-showing and passes it off as what it's not. With the Rockstar beverage can used in the last video, an example of falsity might be that identify the can as a particular constellation of molecules or as an economic object. If you recall, this as structure functions as an interpretive act. But in seeing the can as these things, my understanding covers over its more fundamental mode of self-showing. So in this example, falsity does not mean incorrectness. Rather, it means mistaking something derivative for something fundamental. So what is that fundamental thing being concealed? This brings us to our first question. How is phenomenology related to ontology? What is being covered over, according to Heidegger, are not particular beings, but rather the being of those beings. This covering over of the ontological by the ontic has led to the forgetting of being. This has been one of the major consequences of the metaphysics of presence that Heidegger addressed in this introduction. Phenomenology is needed because it's the method that goes beyond the actual, beyond particular beings, to bring out of hiding the being of beings. In other words, ontology is not just a subject matter for phenomenology, it is phenomenology. Hence, what Heidegger proposes here is a phenomenological ontology. The aim of ontology is to make being stand out or noticeable and to analyze it so to reveal its meaning. This is accomplished in part by the destructuring of tradition, which retrieves from historicity those possibilities that guide Dasein in its function of understanding and questioning. This ontology, Heidegger states, is possible only as phenomenology. This is because, for Heidegger, the self-showing phenomenon concerns the being of beings, how being discloses and conceals itself in and as particular beings. Now, it's at this point that Heidegger makes the famous statement, higher than actuality stands possibility, and that phenomenology is the method that seizes upon being as a possibility. This requires a little unpacking since it's not initially clear what the concepts of actuality and possibility have to do with the question of being. Possibility defines one's being in the world. Dasein is itself in assuming or foregoing those possibilities. The being of beings is disclosed only in the possibilities of Dasein and not in Dasein's actuality, which is, in fact, an ontic determination that risks covering over being. Confusion might arise here in thinking of being as a noun and existence as what is actually here. This is one of the reasons why a consideration of temporality is so important to this analysis. The horizon of time broadens our understanding of being beyond the actual and into the possible. Where is the past and the future? Is it here? Here? What about here? In fact, it's never here because it's always somewhere else. It's always an absence. Now, it might be that the absence of presence can be considered an absence of being, but being is itself the absenting and presenting of particular beings through time. So temporality extends being beyond the actual and into the possible. Our understanding of the past delivers to us our future possibilities. The future delivers to us the ultimate possibility of all, our deaths, which, if we don't flee from it, also discloses to us other possibilities available to us in this life. Question 2. Why is phenomenological ontology a hermeneutic enterprise? Dasein is the being whose ontic and ontological distinctiveness offers unique access to being through the understanding. As such, a phenomenological ontology begins with Dasein, but more specifically with the hermeneutic of Dasein. The term hermeneutics consists of the name of the Greek god Hermes, who is the originator of language and speech, and so serves as a mediator or messenger between the gods and humanity. Interestingly, Hermes comes to be called Mercury in Roman mythology, who is not only a messenger, but also is the god of commerce and financial gain. Language and commerce participate in the activity of exchange, whether it be signs or physical objects. Also, Hermes is known as a trickster or a jokester, and the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan in Seminar 1 states that speech is what makes lying possible. So it's no surprise that Hermes is associated with being this trickster and liar, and in this sense also shares some features with the Norse god Loki. This dual role as messenger and liar converges with the disclosing and uncovering dimension of discourse discussed by Heidegger. Philosophical hermeneutics emerges in the wake of Friedrich Schleiermacher, but is most explicitly connected to Wilhelm Dilthey, who influenced in part by Schleiermacher, developed the concept of the hermeneutic circle, which recognizes how understanding is an iterative process between individual parts of the text and the whole text. As discussed in a previous video, Heidegger has already made use of the hermeneutic circle when it comes to considering the meaning of being in general in its relation to a particular being, Dasein. For Heidegger, phenomenological ontology is a work of interpretation. This is because interpretation or understanding is itself a basic existential structure of Dasein. In other words, Dasein is a being who understands, who interprets its historicity. Consequently, any uncovering of the other basic structures of existence will be through the interpretive activity of Dasein. We should be careful here. Heidegger is not promoting mere perspectivism, where interpretation means a capricious assignment of one meaning over a set of equally valid alternate meanings. We're dealing with something more fundamental than that. Heidegger is offering us a description of the inherent, one might say, universal activity of Dasein as a being who interprets. This interpretive activity belongs to Dasein because Dasein is always a being in the world, situated within a horizon of temporality. As such, interpretation itself is a function of the fundamental existential structures of Dasein, who comes to understand those structures through its interpretive function. And as such, we can see that even the concept of interpretation itself is embedded in a hermeneutical circle. With that, we're done with section 7 and finished with the introduction. We'll work through the themes of this intro throughout the rest of the text, moving back and forth between what has been discussed here and what will be elaborated upon in the remaining text. In doing so, we'll move not in a mere circle, but in a spiral, such that the back and forth between whole and part will lead to a deepening of our understanding over time. Section 8, the final section of this two-part introduction, provides an outline of what is to come. Heidegger divides the work into two parts, each with 3 divisions. Part 1 examines the existential structures of Dasein. Part 2 was intended to provide what Heidegger called a phenomenological destruction of the history of ontology, in which he runs through the thought of Kant, Descartes, and Aristotle. However, a quick skim through the text reveals that he only gets to division 2 of part 1. As such, a large portion of what he plans to address is never accomplished. This has led to all sorts of speculations about what these sections could have been. I'm not as convinced that it's all that great of a mystery, since Much of what he proposes here is covered in other works. Finally, I'll address the most challenging question of all. 3. How should we approach being in time, considering Heidegger's association with Nazism? What's been left unsaid in these videos until now is Heidegger's complicity with Nazism and his failure to acknowledge it, much less repent from it in his life after World War II. And this raises the following question: is there any connection between his philosophy and his associations with Nazism? Responses to such a question have covered the spectrum from there is no relationship at all to the belief that there is a direct link and as such he shouldn't be read. I don't have a ready-made answer to this question, and for better or for worse, I've opted to sit with the tension rather than attempt to resolve it either way. But I will refer to the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, a student of Husserl who was notably impressed and influenced by Heidegger's thought in the late 1920s and early 30s. During World War II, Levinas became a prisoner of war while other members of his family were murdered by the SS. Levinas felt deeply betrayed by Heidegger, and the philosophy he went on to develop is in many ways a trenchant critique of Heidegger's thought. Nonetheless, Levinas laments the terrible truth that the greatest philosopher of the 20th century was a Nazi. This is a tension that will always be part of any study of Heidegger. Levinas felt it, as should we. This does also raise some important hermeneutic questions concerning the relationship in general between the philosopher and their ideas. Thought never emerges in a vacuum. There is, as Heidegger himself claims, a history behind the thought. Yet at the same time, how that history comes to impact that thought is never so straightforward as to be simply reducible to the philosopher's social identities. It's a reason why, for example, I would resist calling Levinas a Jewish philosopher, as if that somehow provided some interpretive key for understanding his work. It's an interesting and indeed important question to consider how his faith and affiliations may have informed his ideas, but that's different than qualifying a philosopher's thought by their social identities. In art, the painting has a life of its own that can't be reduced to the artist, their social identities, nor even the artist's stated intentions imputed upon their own work. I would say the same is true for the work of philosophy. And that's why I bracket these considerations in my attempt to go back to the text itself. A text whose life cannot be reduced to its authors, any more than one's own life can be reduced to the values and actions of one's parents. Again, I do believe one eventually can and perhaps even should confront those questions, and that the answers can be revelatory for understanding the text, just as analyzing one's parents might be helpful in understanding ourselves. However, it's a matter of timing and approach. If one initially comes to a text with the understanding that it was written by someone based on their social identities or even their moral character, you risk covering over the richness of the text by imposing these categories upon them. Categories that, to be honest, function more like stereotypes than productive hermeneutical tools. They limit our understanding of the text to the limits of our understanding of those social categories. It closes the reader off to the various ways the text may contradict our understanding of those identities, as well as even contradict the author's understanding of their own identities. In fact, it's perhaps the contradictions that get at the truth even better than the perceived consistencies and convergences. And with that, we come to the end of today's video. In the next video, we begin part 1, division 1 of Being in Time, which offers a preparatory analysis for considering the existential structures of Dasein. As always, thank you for watching, and until next time, be well.